Right, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about myself. And there's a good reason for that. It's not all ego. So I have not got kids, but I do have what I call an animal family. So if you have a look on the bottom left here, or you can see my two dogs and my cats. And, it's a bit unconventional. It's not for everyone, but for me, they're my family along with my partner. And I'm in a relationship with a man, but that doesn't mean that I've never questioned my sexuality or indeed my gender. You can see in the top left an image of the world, and what that represents is the fact that I grew up in the UK, and that's given me a lot of privilege because I grew up speaking English. It's meant that I can go and I've been able to go and work in lots of countries teaching English. And it's also there to represent the fact that although I am British, my mum's parents were not British. They came from Poland and Finland as immigrants to the UK. And so there's a mixed cultural background there. The money is there to represent the fact that although, I have quite a financially comfortable job now, my life wasn't always that financially comfortable. And I also enjoy knitting and swimming, amongst all these other things about me. And then finally, there's a brain bottom right to represent the fact that my brain works a little bit differently from some people. So I have a condition called ADHD. And that means that I can experience difficulties with concentration, amongst many, many other things. So why am I telling you these things today? Well, the point I'm trying to make is that people are complex. They are much, much more than they can initially seem to us. They can have different identities, hobbies, interests, relationships. All of these things that might not immediately be apparent to us. And the same is true of pretty much everybody in the world. The whole world is made up of people who are complex, who are not what we might immediately assume them to be from looking at them. And that's true for our students as well. Our students could have a whole range of identities. They could come from socioeconomic backgrounds that might not immediately be apparent. They may have same-sex parents. We just don't know the experiences and identities of our students simply by looking at them. And our students are going to have vast and varied experiences and identities amongst them. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because I want to underline the diversity of our students and our teachers and contrast it with what might usually be presented in a standard textbook. So obviously I'd made this textbook up, but we can see from this cover, it's quite a typical cover that we might get for an ELT textbook. And ELT textbooks, I think, as a general rule, tend not to particularly well reflect the diversity of the world and the diversity of students within our classrooms. So there's a norm to lots of ELT materials. We tend to see binary gender. So gender is just represented as men and women and nothing else. We tend to see a focus on Christianity and the global north. And often Oxford and Cambridge for some reason. We tend to see heterosexual relationships. We tend to see middle class people and experiences, non-disabled people, so people who are not disabled. We tend to see white people as the dominant cultural identity. And then what else is represented tends to be kind of young, attractive, and thin. So there's very much a norm, I think, to ELT materials. And this might not automatically seem problematic, but it can be very problematic because what happens when we have a norm is that certain things are pushed out. And that means that in our standard ELT textbooks or materials, we're omitting some topics because they're not considered maybe appropriate, or they're considered too controversial. We're erasing some people, some places, and some experiences. And we're also representing some people and places and experiences in very simplistic and potentially harmful ways. So, who is omitted? What's erased? And what's misrepresented? What tends to be erased, I think, in ELT materials, and this is, I'm making generalizations, so this doesn't count for every single material, but we tend to see non-binary gender identities erased. So people who are not men or women, but have another gender identity, they tend to be erased, as do people with a range of romantic and different sexual orientations. So we tend not to see same-sex families, for example, in materials. And then the other identities that are pushed to the side are represented in quite simplistic ways. So if they're represented at all, and they're represented quite infrequently. So things that tend to fit into this category are non-Christian religions, places and people in the global south, working class people, disabled people, people of colour, older people. All of these people tend to fall to the edges of ELT materials, or they're just kind of pushed out, or they're not represented, or they're represented in quite limited ways. So one example of this, I don't expect you to read this text, it's just kind of here as a visual prompt. But this is something I see a lot in ELT materials, is a country, typically a country outside the global north, represented in a very simplistic way. So this is a story about someone from the global north, someone from Europe or America, who's gone to visit Thailand. And Thailand only exists as a tourist destination. And this is something we see again and again and again in ELT materials, that places are represented in very simplistic ways. And again, this might not seem very harmful, but if that is the only impression that our students take away of that place, if it's their only experience with that place, then it can really embed some very harmful ideas and stereotypes. In particular, we see this in materials happening with depictions of countries in Africa, and the Pan-Arab region as well, but countries are depicted as kind of quite simplistic and as focuses of charity. And this is a very kind of dangerous and worrying simplification. And this happens for places, but also for a whole range of identities as well, So this is where inclusive materials come in. And this is why inclusive materials are important, because these simplistic or erasing representations really aren't helping our students at all. So I'm going to think about representing the real world and inclusive materials. So what are inclusive materials? Well, let's start by saying inclusive isn't the perfect word. If we had a bit longer, I'd unpack this word and explain why. But we're going to use this word because it's well known and helpful. So inclusive materials, like this material here, don't center one thing as normal. So we don't pretend the whole world is in the UK or in Europe, and everybody isn't heterosexual, and we have a range of ethnicities, for example. So it represents everyone and their experiences, and it represents people fully, or places fully. So Thailand isn't just a tourist destination, it's represented in all its complexity. And it includes a range of topics. So inclusive materials don't exclude topics that, because they're controversial, we would embrace them and investigate them. And the reason for doing this, and I think a lot of people or some people can get stuck on this, is, why are we doing this? Why do we need to include all these different identities? What's wrong with what we've done before? Well, the thing is that because the world is diverse, if we think back to that image I did of myself, that if we think that people are complex and the world is diverse, then really our materials need to reflect that. Because our students might have identities that are typically underrepresented or marginalized, if they can't see themselves in the materials, then it's very likely that those materials are not going to be meaningful for them. So what inclusive materials can do is provide role models for people. If you can see yourself in materials, if you can see somebody with the same identity as you being successful, then that's a role model for you. There's plenty of evidence that inclusive materials that represent a whole range of experiences and identities, improve engagement and belonging and academic success. And it's kind of obvious. If you've ever taught, you know that materials that mean something to students are going to engage them and will be more likely for them to engage with and to work through and to absorb the information. In addition, we can also give students a language to describe themselves. So, for example, if a student experiences mental health challenges, but that's never described in a book, then they can't talk about themselves or their own experiences. Or if, for example, a student of color is reading a book and the unit on appearance does not give them the language to describe themselves, then that student is immediately excluded from that book. And then finally, it teaches students about the real world. So what we're doing what we're trying to do as teachers is not just, teach them English, but teach students the English, but also to prepare them for reality, for the real world. And students need to understand the diversity of the world and how to interact with people with different experiences and identities. And that's why inclusive materials are helpful, because they give students that experience of other identities and the ability to empathize and understand them. So the question is, if you're convinced that inclusive materials are right for you and for your students, which world should you represent? Now, obviously, I'm British. I come from a particular political and social context. And when I'm creating materials, I bring that to those materials. And you need to think about the context that you're working in and your students to decide what's right for you in terms of inclusion. So in your social context or national context, it might be more appropriate for you to include, say, an Indigenous community that faces discrimination within your materials. So you've really got to decide what's right for you and what's right for yours, and particularly what's right for your students. And then the next question is, well, how do I decide what's right for my students? And I would say, ask your students. So you can, do anonymous surveys with students and find out what topics they're interested in, what they want to see represented in their materials. You can also collaborate with colleagues. Each individual person only has their own experience, but if we come together with colleagues, then we're bringing together lots of diverse identities and experiences, and that allows us to build more diverse materials. And then also, you can research and learn yourself outside of the classroom about different identities and experiences so that you can bring them into your materials. But the big question, if you're convinced about the why of inclusive materials, is how you do it. So what you can do is use existing inclusive materials. So there's plenty of these. Here's two examples here. Hands Up for Peace, which is by the Hands Up organization and includes lessons looking at the topic of peace. There's this material here by Peter J. Fulliger, which represents LGBT plus identities. And there's also a material called Raise Up. So these are small magazine-style textbooks that you can download as PDFs, and these include a range of different identities. So these are something you can use in your classroom, but they're also, they might be good models if you want to create your own materials. So the next question, if you don't want to use those existing inclusive materials, is to ask whether you want to write or adapt and supplement materials. And that's what we're going to have a think about now. So these are my tips for more inclusive materials. The first thing you can do is diversify the topics in your materials. So I'm not saying throw away all your standard topics of work and family. These can stay, but think about adding additional topics to those. So you could look at adding topics related to social injustice. So for example, this text on the right is a text I've created about the gender pay gap. It's very, very simple to create. I looked at 3 different sources about the gender pay gap, and I created a short text and I added a photo. Peter's brilliant. And so you can create this, and you could use this in a lesson on work. You could use it just to kind of supplement the materials that are in your textbook. And you can also link students to real life articles about the gender pay gap or social media videos about the gender pay gap. But you can include these kinds of things as stimulation for discussion about new topics. You can also include topics that may be stigmatized. And this is a topic, a material that I've created about panic attacks. And to do this, I went to various charity websites and put this information together and, got someone to check it for me. You could work in teams of teachers and check your own work, check each other's work to ensure that it's okay. But this allows us to kind of address topics that might not typically be addressed in materials. So the reason that this is important, I think, to address these kinds of topics related to social injustice and stigma is because they're not normally mentioned in the classroom. And it's really important that students understand, I think, how the world works, but also how to address things that are unsaid, because students need to know how to discuss everything in English, not just the most kind of acceptable topics. Now, there are lots of existing resources, and this is just one example from the UK. The Black Curriculum is an interesting resource that looks at racism in the UK, colonialism, migration. But you could find existing resources on other topics, which I think you could bring into the classroom. When you're introducing new topics, do tread carefully, because if we're thinking about something related to stigma or something related to discrimination, there's a good chance that, there are students in your class who might have experienced that stigma or discrimination. It might be something that's quite sensitive for them or traumatic to discuss. So, as I said before, be led by your students, find out what topics they're okay discussing. Be ready to support them with that topic. So if you know you're going to be covering something about mental health, find out about mental health for students in your, trigger warnings too, mental health support for students in your area, or, a helpline or something like that. Also be sensitive. So if you know that a student experiences mental health difficulties and you're studying mental health, don't call on that student to talk about their mental health issues, because that will be traumatizing for them. Don't ask someone to become a symbol for that kind of discrimination or identity. Try to do it regularly. So don't make looking at more challenging topics something you do once a year, say for a particular day or month, but do it regularly through the year. And in addition to looking at these topics, also help students to think critically about these topics. So encourage them to understand, the kinds of ways that these discrimination is constructed, and to think critically about it and how they can take action against it themselves. That's a whole presentation in itself, but I wanted just to touch on that. Okay, so the next thing is to diversify the visual landscape. So that means to try and change the photos you use in materials. Now, there are lots of good free photo banks now that provide diverse images. And it's a good idea to work with your colleagues to kind of put together a list of these. And I've also got one on my website if you want to have a look there. There's a list of diverse photos. But you can see here this massive difference in these photos on the left, which predominantly represent white, young, thin people. And these images on the left, which represent a broader range of ethnicities, gender identity, and also age as well. So that's a really simple way, I think, with images of changing what's happening in your materials. And then the final thing I want to say to you is to diversify the text and audio visual content. So we've thought about diversifying all your topics, and that's great because that brings in critical thinking and an awareness of the world. And we've thought about changing your photos, and that's great because it's an immediate there's an immediate visual impact of diversity for the students. But it doesn't necessarily, just changing the photos is just a kind of aesthetic thing. It doesn't necessarily fundamentally change the content of your lessons. So make sure you also change the text and audio visual based content of your lessons. So I want to just show you quickly one example of that. So wherever you can in your materials, represent a range of people and places and experiences and a range of identities. So if you have a text, say, that represents 3 people and it's talking about jobs, you can take that text out of the book and you can swap out some of the people so that you're providing a more diverse representation of reality. So, for example, this text here, we've got Cara, who's an electrician. So that's subverting gender stereotypes. Likewise, Bruno is a nurse. So that's subverting some gender stereotypes. And we've also included Ellis, who is non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. And you can see here how simple it is just to include a range of identities. And when we do this, it's really nice if we can do it in an incidental way. So we're saying that the world is diverse. We don't need to make a big announcement about the fact that we're representing people. Because they're just part of the world, we're just including them. They're just there. So represent a range of people, places and experiences, but just as part of the norm, and represent them authentically. So don't just represent, say, Thailand as a tourist destination, but represent it in all its complexity. Complexity is good. And then also, where possible, try to give people voice. So I know that for you as teachers, it might be difficult to create your own audio material, but you could think about creating stuff between you as a group of teachers and recording stuff yourself or using authentic audio. But if you are going to write things yourself, it's very easy just to incidentally represent different experiences. If you look at this text here at the bottom, it's from a unit on reading, and someone says that they prefer to read biographies and books on history and different countries. They usually read books on the bus to work. He works in a factory and he doesn't buy books because it's too expensive, so he borrows books. So we can see here a different representation of socioeconomic experience. So it's very possibly more simple than it seems to bring in different incidental representations of different experiences. So to sum up really about representing people, just represent people as part of the norm, give them voice and represent their different everyday experiences. So finally, to sum up, and thanks for bearing with me for going over time, where possible, remember that your students are very diverse and could be more diverse than they initially seem. Find out what they want to know about and do some simple things to change your materials, change the topics, change the visual landscape, and change the text and audio-visual content. And if you're not confident doing that yourself, use existing materials, but also, work together with people that you know to create materials that are relevant for your students. Okay, the end.
The end. Lottie, thank you so much. I think you kept all of us hanging from your lips about what you were saying. Kind of nodding along as we're going along. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for staying with us. I hope, like me, Lottie has given you a lot of food for thought and challenged all of us, I think, to think differently. So really grateful for that.